Good afternoon, and welcome to our workshop on data. I am so excited for this workshop because I'm a data nerd, and I hope that all of you have as much excitement for data as I do and as our presenters do. My name is Linda Jensen. I am the Education Director for the Arizona Housing Coalition, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Most of you are coalition members, and so you probably already know a fair amount about what the Arizona Housing Coalition does. But for those of you who are not as familiar, we are a statewide network. And the network is made up of folks who do work along the housing continuum, everything from folks who are doing homeless service providing to affordable housing, and development and financing and policy and all kinds of housing advocacy along that continuum. So we are a broad and diverse network of people who all adhere to this common mission of making sure that every Arizonan has a safe, affordable place to call home. And the coalition supports the work in three main ways. The first is coordination. We coordinate on a regional and statewide level. The second is advocacy. We make sure that advocacy is happening on the local, state, and federal level. And then the third is education. We educate our members and the public on topics of importance and relevance. And speaking of that, that's what brings us to today, a very important and relevant topic. With us today are Ash Us, who is the founder of From the Ground Up, and Nathan Smith, who is the Chief Program Officer from Phoenix Rescue Mission. They have conducted research that is very comprehensive, and today they're going to share with us not only how they came about their research, but the results that came from it, and then ask us to reflect on how those results can impact our day-to-day work. In a moment, I'm going to be going off camera. I will be in the background helping to monitor the chat. I do encourage all of you to use the chat to put your questions in, and Ash and Nathan will be getting to those after their presentation. If we don't get to all of your questions today, we are also going to send a follow-up email that will include the presentation, the report, the contact information for our presenters, and this recording so that you can share it with any colleagues who were not able to make it. So with that, I turn the presentation over to Ash and Nathan.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Again, I just want to echo what Linda said and just saying I appreciate the work of the Arizona Housing Coalition and everything it does as an agency advocating on behalf of those who are housing insecure in our state. It's been a great pleasure for us to do this study, to invite so many people's voices to speak into the issues surrounding homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity around the Valley. We did this study for two major reasons. We had two primary objectives. Those objectives were to, first and foremost, determine in the shifting environment what Phoenix Rescue Mission's mission should be moving forward, as so much has changed around COVID and as so much has changed around the issues that we were studying. But then also we wanted to make a meaningful contribution back into our community's data repository to say, hey, as others from a regional and from an organizational level are making decisions around how to best approach these challenges that our community is facing, we wanted to make sure that everyone had the same kind of data that we were working with to do their own sort of decision making. So we're really pleased to unveil this study, really pleased to be working with Ash on it. I also want to throw it over to our CEO, Ken Brisset, to share a word about the study as well.
Thanks, Nathan. Hello, everyone. Many of you, I'm sure, were with us some months ago when we introduced the concept of conducting this study. And if you're like me, you're all about doing it right and not doing it fast. And I'm really happy that we did not do it fast, because what came out of this was a really extensive set of data with some really extraordinary information that we're going to share with you today. As Linda said earlier, if you're a data geek, you're in for a treat. If you're not a data geek, you're in for a treat, because Ash created a presentation that, whether you're into data or you just simply want to hear, even in story form, what the data told us about homelessness and food insecurity and addiction in the Valley, this presentation's for you. As I said, it's extensive. As Nathan said, the idea for this study came from Phoenix Rescue Mission back in the day, thinking that we were going to go in a certain direction around the services we provide. And then COVID hit. And we realized that where we thought we should go may not be where we should go. And we're very blessed in that we realized we shouldn't go off in a room or even just with a small number of people and determine where we should be. We should ask the people we serve. And that led us to connect with Ash. And after an awful lot of time, but really, really well spent time, we have the information we're going to share with you today. We had this mentality that asking the people that we serve truly what they think, what they need, and why they're in the situation we're in would put us all, everyone who's witnessing this presentation, in a better position to serve them. So with that, we're very proud of the results. We're very happy that you're here with us. And I think I'm going to throw it over to Ash, and Ash is going to walk you through our study.
Great. Thank you all again for being here. My name is Ash. I am the executive director and the founder of a Phoenix-based consulting agency called From the Ground Up. We're going to go through this data, and we're just really grateful and appreciative that you all are here. As Linda said, please use the chat, and we will make sure that there is time at the end for questions, as well as any necessary follow-up. So just jumping right in, this presentation is a summary of findings from our regional gap analysis on homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity. Just want to shout out Phoenix Rescue Mission for this amazing partnership and investment, especially Nathan and all of his work in managing this project. I also really want to uplift Daisy Talavera and Carly Bradley, who were the data analysts and team members on the From the Ground Up team who made this possible. I absolutely could not have done this without them. They were excellent, they were thorough, and they did a beautiful job. So just to ground us, this is the first study of its kind in the nation. And that's so because it's the first to include perspectives, quantitative and qualitative data from 754 people experiencing homelessness. It is representative of experiences in 10 cities across Maricopa County. And we had over 12 regional partners who were key partners in making this a reality. This chart here shows the breakdown of the total number of surveys and interviews of people that we connected with for this study. This study included 3 phases, the first of which was pretty specific to Phoenix Rescue Mission, as well as phase 3. So for the purposes of our presentation, we're just looking at this phase 2 data, which was the regional data on homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity. And just something to point out, this pie chart includes the number of people from the TLC and the CLC. Those are Phoenix Rescue Mission's residential campuses. So we won't be sharing findings again because that was organization specific, but this was the breakdown of who we connected with as part of this study. As you all know, many of you are members of the coalition and you're involved in this space, so you know that across our county, rates of homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity are increasing. For the first part of this study, we spent some time looking at the data that we already have, looking at literature, looking at our region's current understanding of these issues. And one way that we did that was in partnership and in looking at 211 calls for service. So this table here just shows the percent increases across our 10 partner cities for this study between 2021 and 2022. And I really encourage you all to look at the 211 site and see this data. It's very public, it's very available, and we just needed a little help with understanding it. But if you look at this, you'll see that in every city, there are significant increases in all of the areas that we looked at: housing, shelter, addiction, and food. Our point in time data recently came out, so this just shows the percent increase and in some cases decrease from year to year. So as we look from 2020 to 2023, we all once again know that homelessness is on the rise, especially unsheltered homelessness across our region. For phase 2 of this study, our research question was this. With a focus on homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity in the 10 largest cities in Maricopa County, we wanted to know what were the available resources and unmet needs, and how might Phoenix Rescue Mission be a partner in addressing these unmet needs. And so if you remember that pie chart with all of the different populations, this just breaks down the specific groups that we connected with and surveyed for this study. It was very important for us to gather a diverse perspective and to recognize that people working in these services, people experiencing these challenges, people working at the city level, they all have different perspectives, but all very valuable perspectives and experiences connecting with these issues. So this was who we connected with. For the methodology, just to break it down again, we picked the 10 largest cities population-wise. That was our way of picking 10 cities, and that was how we did that. As I mentioned, we started with a pretty extensive literature review. A big portion of our time was looking again at data that was already out there, similar studies, really understanding the data that is already available in our region. We have a lot of great data sources, but as many of us know, we wanted more. We included quantitative data collection. So this involved the use of multiple choice questions, Likert scale questions that could give us some sort of way to understand the needs, the gaps, the experiences with these topics from a quantitative way. But the bulk of this study is heavily qualitative. So I just want to ground us as we're going through this presentation. The real meat of this and the bulk of this was qualitative data that we collected in open response questions. Concerning how we gathered this data, we had a couple of different ways. So for people experiencing homelessness, we were out for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. Many of you on this call or that I saw had signed up, were kind enough for me to ride along with your outreach teams and go out and do surveys. So thank you all so much. Really just cannot reiterate enough how we wouldn't have been able to do this study without all of your partnership. We collected data from people who were experiencing food insecurity but not homeless. And so we had a huge number of food banks and food pantries that allowed us and kindly welcomed us to their space so that we could survey people. And then we had a few inpatient recovery programs and treatment centers that also allowed us to collect data from people who were experiencing substance use but not homelessness, because we were curious to see if the data would differ whether or not someone had housing or not. We did a good amount of virtual online work as well, just given the pandemic and scheduling. So many of you were in focus groups or Zoom interviews, a wide variety of different ways that we collected the data. And then another thing to point out was that every person who was experiencing homelessness received a $10 Visa gift card. And that was an investment made by Phoenix Rescue Mission so that we could incentivize participation, but also acknowledge the fact that it was time consuming. Some of these surveys took 15, 20 minutes. In cases where people couldn't read or had some language barriers, we conducted them more like an interview than just a survey. So individuals spent a lot of time and we wanted to compensate them. And all surveys were anonymous, they were offered in Spanish, and then permissible by informed consent. We're going to go through the data for each of our topics. So again, homelessness, addiction, and food insecurity. So I'll try my best as we're going through because there's so much data here to just remind you what we're talking about. But for this next section, we're looking specifically at people experiencing homelessness, those 754 people across the cities. One thing I forgot to mention was that our goal in terms of how many people to interview in the cities, we based that off of 30% of the unsheltered PIT number. So we looked at the PIT count, not from this year, but from the previous year that we had, and we decided our goal would be 30% of the unsheltered population in all of the 10 cities. And most of the cities we met, if not exceeded that goal, with a few exceptions. Here's the demographic breakdown of our sample that was experiencing homelessness. So our ages were pretty evenly distributed. The largest group of folks were between 35 and 44, smallest under 18 and over 65. One thing to point out, we expected some more seniors. We just know that conversationally and nationally, there is a rise in senior homelessness, and we did not see that in our sample. One potential reason why that could be, again, was just our methodology. A lot of the surveys with those folks were done just in alleys and in parks. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that that means that more of our seniors and vulnerable folks were in shelter. We did have some folks who were sheltered at Cass and Andre House who were staying there. We had some folks at the East Valley Men's Center or Men's Shelter who we surveyed as well. In alignment with our regional and national trends, most people were identified as male, and this aligned again with what we know countywide and nationally. About 30% of our sample was Hispanic or Latinx. And also, like our county data, our city data, our national data, there was an overrepresentation of people of color. So there were more people who were identified as Black or African American, American Indian, and multiple races than what's represented in our countywide and census data. One of the first things we asked folks who were experiencing homelessness was what was the longest amount of time that they had ever stayed in a shelter. And here we can see that 332 of the 712 folks who answered this question said that they had never stayed in a shelter. So we intentionally put that in pretty early on just to ground us and remind us that a lot of the folks that we engage don't have experience with shelter. And then we see a lot of responses about shelter from the folks who have, but we see a good number of folks who have never engaged with a shelter service in their homelessness history. One of the big things that we saw that really struck us when we asked people if they identified with any of the disabling conditions that are included in the point in time count, we saw a real difference in our self-reported rate for substance use compared to the PIT data, as well as mental illness. And there's a lot of reasons why this could be the case. You know, not every person in the PIT count is surveyed, they're counted, but they may not be asked the question if they're sleeping or they decline to participate in the survey. Another potential thing was that, keeping in mind the methodology, all of the surveys were administered by myself and outreach teams, many of whom have deep, close relationships with the folks that we were serving. So it's always a possibility that people just were more honest or more forthcoming than maybe they would be with a stranger or someone who didn't necessarily have a social work background. But really what this highlighted and meant for us was just that we all see and discuss and in conversation speak to the need for additional data collection, because we know that our deeply, deeply helpful point in time count is just one piece of the data equation to understand the region's issues. And so this for us was just really a big way of showing like we need additional data work. And then specifically the prevalence of substance use, you know, in an advocacy space, it's something that from what I recall for the longest time, the work was reminding people that not everyone on the streets was struggling with addiction. And this data, as well as data you'll see a little bit further on in the presentation, it really points to a higher prevalency of substance abuse and addiction than I've seen in my years working in this space. One of the other things, this was a qualitative question that we asked people for what was the primary reason that you ended up experiencing homelessness? And we'll get to a slide in a minute that explains why we picked some of these codes or these factors. But as you can see, the number one reason was an economic factor, things that were a product of this economy and the times that we're living in, things like losing a job, lack of work, finances, money. Just something to point out that if someone responded to this question and said, oh, well, I got into a medical accident and then I lost my job, we would have coded that as a health issue because that was their first response. Transitioning into that, we see a high prevalence of people who reported a health issue, things like medical issues, mental illness, substance use, and then this other code of a familial issue. And this included things like death of a loved one, domestic violence, family conflict, followed by the lack of affordable housing. And then these categories at the bottom just represent some other high frequency responses that received their own code. Another thing to just point out, we know that the point in time count this year similarly asked if homelessness was caused by COVID or by a rent increase. And we didn't include it here, but our numbers are pretty close, within 2 to 3% of the point in time data for those two reasons for homelessness as well. And here were some of the quotes that make up those codes. Throughout this presentation, we're going to give you all some numbers and some data because that's what's helpful, but we're really going to make sure that we spend time just hearing and witnessing what people so vulnerably and so kindly shared with us. And a lot of these also highlight, the intersection of challenges that create homelessness and houselessness. It's rarely just as simple as one thing. And we selected these quotes again for that reason. They show some of the complexity and the intersection of different things that create someone not having a home. Where we got those codes from, it was really helpful to be able to look at previous data. Unfortunately, the only really similar kind of big-ish type study that we had found was this from 2013 that came out of Morrison. But from this study in 2013, the top blue are their reasons for homelessness in that study. And then below it, we show ours. And so if you look, the number one things are the same. And it was really helpful to be able to look at our data and match the codes and to see that even back in 2013, we saw similar responses from people who were asked about how they ended up without housing. In 2013, substance abuse was separate from health. And in the fields over the last couple of years, there's been more of a recognition of substance abuse as a health issue. And so that's why, for the purposes of our study, we included that as one health issue. But this really just highlights, and it was exciting for us and also sad in a sense to see that the same reasons that people ended up on the streets in 2013 were still prevalent and still prominent from 2021 to 2023. It was really important for us and for our partners to try to understand the really hot question of why are people not in shelter? And when we asked folks, if you weren't in shelter, why not? The number one response by almost 50% of everyone who answered this question was that they had a negative experience with the shelter. And we tried to keep that pretty specific to factors that could be addressed by providers, by programs, etc. So the things that came up, and these are in order of frequency, were not feeling safe, security, having your belongings stolen, theft, overcrowding, cleanliness, followed by this common thread or theme of shelters being inaccessible. And what that meant specifically were that there either were no shelters available, that people didn't know where they could go for shelter, or that they couldn't get to shelter, maybe because there wasn't one in their city, or they had a job in Chandler, but the shelter was in Tempe or something to that extent. Through the process of this coding, this qualitative data coding, we wanted to really honor the integrity of the data. And so I went through the data, Daisy Talavera went through the data. We had a bunch of sets of eyes on these codes to really check ourselves for bias and for things like that. And that's how we ended up with this number 3 item, curfew and rules, because there were 8.8% of the people who answered this question just used the word, the curfew or the rules. I don't want that many rules. The curfew doesn't work for me. That, in our opinion, that didn't necessarily mean that we just couldn't conclude with absolute certainty that it was either personal choice or that they couldn't access shelter. And so it was common enough to receive its own code, and that was number 3. And our number 4 code was personal choice. And so that was 7.4% of our population who said, I don't want to go in shelter. I don't want to be out. I just like being outside. I'd rather sleep outside. I'm happy on the streets, etc. And even within those folks, it's certainly possible that a response, I don't want to go in shelter, could be because of one of the other codes, but we just don't know that. And so we had to code it appropriately. And then we saw some folks also talk about a negative perception of shelter, which was interesting. About 5% of our samples said, like, I've heard bad things, which makes me think of that very first graph that we showed y'all, which showed that about 331 of our population had never gone to a shelter. So just something for us all to think of, how much does the negative perception of shelter affect entries into shelter, and then substance abuse as well. And here were some of the quotes that we pulled and that comprised those themes and those answers to that question. I'm realizing as we're looking at this, I also forgot to shout out Claire, who works with Phoenix Rescue Mission, who took all of these beautiful photos. I definitely should have acknowledged her at the beginning. They came from someone on the Phoenix Rescue Mission team. As you may remember or recall, we didn't want to just ask people going through it about it. We wanted to ask the people working with them, the people funding programs for them, etc. And so this slide shows our findings from those focus groups, those interviews, the perspectives about homelessness from our 35 interviews with elected officials, city staff, first responders. The biggest thing that came up about what was working well, things that you all, I'm sure, know and love and appreciate on a daily basis, the role of partnerships in this work, specifically interdepartmental city partnerships. A lot of the municipalities just spoke to how effective it had been to have an interdepartmental team for this city that includes all of the departments that intersect with homelessness, as well as partnerships with service providers. One of the municipalities, or 2 of them actually, mentioned having designated homelessness response teams. So it was really meaningful and impactful for them to have a team that could go out and triage a call or an issue. And then on the next tier of that, some sort of electronic triage or ticket system to track it and to authentically and to honestly see what happened after that engagement. Regarding what was not working, the number 1 thing was housing. It came up the most in every one of the interviews, just not having enough housing in our system, followed by this lack of public education awareness. This was something that I perhaps didn't expect that to be the second most thing that came up, but it was so prevalent and so frequent to hear mayors, city council members, city staff members, police officers talk about this idea that people don't have an understanding of the issue of homelessness. The general public doesn't understand it. They don't know the process. People experiencing it don't know where they can go. Followed by the mental health system and its challenges. A lot of comments about that. Additional comments about people refusing services. That was a huge challenge, especially on the side of first responders, so firefighters and police officers that we surveyed. And then just one thing to point out, this number 5 thing about relying on policing, what was interesting was that came up with the highest frequency among the police officers that we surveyed. And so a lot of what they shared was just their frustration and their experience that they were being asked to provide, in many cases, social work services or triage services, when that's wildly different from the role that they had initially assumed or intended in becoming a police officer. And so here are some of those quotes to speak to that. And just to give you all as a heads up, I haven't been watching the chat. I know we have some folks monitoring. So once we get to the end of the homelessness data, I'll check in with Nathan and Linda and see if there's anything pretty time sensitive. So I don't want people to think that we're not here, we're not answering stuff. We just had to format it this way because so many folks signed up to be here with us today. We also surveyed and interviewed faith partners, business leaders, and case managers, direct service providers. The case managers, social work folks, that was an online survey that went out, as was the survey for business owners and neighborhood leaders. The only thing that came up here, what was working, and there is a little star there because from case managers / direct service providers, as well as our business leaders, business owners, etc., there weren't any comments about what was working, which just from a data perspective spoke to a lot of experiences with the things that were not going well. And some of those things were similar to what other groups said about homelessness, not having housing. This concept of not having appropriate shelter came up specifically with our case managers, direct service providers, and just want to, throughout this presentation, constantly be seeing the common threads. What those comments had to say, appropriate shelter, a case manager would say, oh, what's not working is when it's Friday night at 10 p.m. and I have a client with a dog and there's literally nowhere else that I can take them. So when we think to that slide from people directly going through it about why they're not in shelter, this was a synchronicity, a connection point that we saw between the different groups that we surveyed. People also spoke about the prevalence of addiction and substance use, this lack of public education awareness, and then clients lacking personal support systems. We asked our case managers and service providers if their clients had support systems, and the vast majority said no, they don't. And even for folks who said yes, in a lot of cases, those case managers, outreach teams themselves were the client's support systems. And here were some quotes from those groups. And so as we wrap up this section on homelessness, we just wanted to summarize some of the high-level things and our key takeaways from what we learned in all of this data collection that we did specific to homelessness. Partnerships are key. That was the one thing that came up that was working well, that was really critical. If you can see in the quotes, a lot of the faith partners talked about the role of partnering with cities and with organizations like Community Bridges and Phoenix Rescue Mission to provide the services that they don't have. Another thing that we really learned from this data was that homelessness is a challenge, but homelessness itself was not the problem. It was the result of many other problems that came up for people. This one focus on inaccessible or ineffective shelter programs, keeping in mind that, again, 50% of our sample had a negative experience with shelter and 19% of them couldn't access it. Then this lack of housing, I mean, the housing was huge. There's one quote I just constantly bring up, and I think it was someone in one of the cities who said, our true Achilles heel is the housing market. And we saw that. We saw that with homelessness in all of the data and all of the populations that we spoke to. And then this focus and this prevalence of economic factors like unemployment and rising costs of living that directly contribute to homelessness, as well as inefficient and under-resourced healthcare systems to address medical issues, mental illness, substance abuse addiction. There was a sub-theme in the mental health category of the phrase revolving door, and that came up a good number of times, not quite enough to be its own big code on our slide, but it was prevalent. Followed by this lack of public education awareness. That was interesting to see how many people brought that up. It was as if all of the folks, except for people experiencing homelessness, recognize this huge need for more education, more understanding about this topic. And then we saw a lack of familial support. If you remember in the reasons for homelessness slide, a lack of familial support was, I think, the number 4 theme for why people ended up on the streets. We saw a good number of folks say that they didn't have anyone in their support system that they could go to, no family, etc. And it helped us to just really understand and see the complexity again, the intersection of things in the homelessness space. And when you get the slides at the bottom, like below the slides, there are the links to all of these articles, but we really just wanted to see, okay, did what we find align with not just what we know to be true from our experience, but from data, from the literature, from news articles? And the answer was yes. These articles are just a combination of things speaking to some of the things that we saw, which again is that homelessness is a housing problem. The increases in homelessness directly due to inflation and housing costs. The connectedness between healthcare needs and homelessness, and this piece from the New York Times that if housing was a healthcare issue, should Medicaid pay the rent? And just, other articles and things, we could see that our data was cohesive. It was in alignment with not just regional, but national conversations about the issue of homelessness. Before we go any further, Nathan or Linda, were there any big things in the chat or things that you want us to spend a little time on before we get into talking about food insecurity?
There was one question that I think we can take right now, which is when it comes to, this was asked by Zoe, when it comes to not accessing shelter, was being separated from pets and or other family members a recurring theme mentioned by participants?
Yeah, that's a great question. Those both came up, but not in the highest frequency that we saw. The biggest access issue to shelter was really about like the location or there just not being shelter. But we did see people say, I don't want to leave my pet, or I don't want to leave my boyfriend, my mom, etc. So we did see that.
I think that's good for now. I've been hammering through most of them as we go, and then I got a couple saved for the end.
Okay, great, thanks. And now to transition into food insecurity. So these were perspectives from different folks about this issue. As a reminder, we not only asked people on the streets about food insecurity, but we surveyed people who were not experiencing homelessness. So our total sample for this was 205. We surveyed 205 people who were currently housed and still struggling to access food. We were able to successfully interview people in every city. We were able to connect with a food bank in every city except for one city that partnered with another city because they didn't quite have their own food bank. But this data is representative of all 10 of our partner cities. When we asked people who were currently housed and still struggling to access food, how long they've been struggling with food, about 50%, 47% said that they have been struggling for less than 6 months, which again, to keep in mind some of the themes in the previous sections and other findings throughout this, when we think about just the times that we're living in and the cost of living increases, that made sense to us that about half of the folks were people who had not been experiencing food insecurity 6 months ago. And then about half of them utilized food services about 2 to 3 times per month. One thing just to point out in this is that we asked a lot of these folks about their experiences with resources and accessing services. And in fairness, they were all already connected to a food bank. So just an area for future research would be to connect with people who were food insecure that were unable to access a food bank. But again, this is those folks. When we asked them what would make healthier food easier to access, the number one thing were more farmers markets, followed by another grocery store in my community and more food distribution agencies and pantries. And the answer choices that we provided for food data were, we matched them with previous food needs assessment from different counties. So we wanted to keep it in alignment so that we could compare as apples to apples as possible. So that's where these answer choices came from. These ones were not open response, but people have asked when we've presented this to Phoenix Rescue Mission or been surprised to see this #1 thing of more farmers markets, because for a lot of folks, farmers markets can be pretty expensive and a little swanky and, not the most accessible. But what we learned and what we saw was that a lot of the folks who said this referenced the Double Bucks program. So it's a program at farmers markets where people who have an EBT card and have SNAP benefits can receive additional tokens or vouchers to double the value that they receive in fresh produce. So when we thought of that, it made sense why people said that. We also asked this group of people if there was one thing that could be done to help you with having access to affordable and healthy food, what would that be? And similar to the homelessness data, we saw a prevalence with access issues. The #1 thing was that food banks were inaccessible, meaning that people couldn't get transportation to or from there. Or if people were walking there, then they couldn't carry all their food back. They needed more food banks that were closer to them and just a greater variety. And then we saw a lot of folks talk about food bank hours and reference that they could not find a food bank with evening or weekend availability, which made sense, right? A lot of folks are working and may not be able to go and get to a food bank. When we think of the previous slide about people wanting more farmers markets, that also struck us as interesting because a lot of the farmers markets that we have across our region happen on weekends. So it just offered a potential insight into a way to increase access to food. We also saw this economic factors theme come up. People specifically reference inflation, increases in cost, work issues, and what that meant was like, I haven't gotten a raise in a long time, even though the cost of food is going up, or I lost my job and now I really can't figure out what to do for food. And then just the lack of money, people straight up saying, I don't have enough money for food. Food is too expensive and I cannot afford it. And then the third theme here were issues of food quality. People saying that they wanted more fresh food, more choices in the type of food, and more farmers markets. And here were some of the quotes from folks about food. Yeah, one of the things that really just struck me, this quote on the far right, this blue one, I'm a single mother of 3 and I just lost my food stamps because my gross income was $300 per month, too high for a family of 4. And part of me wishes, or a big part of me wishes I could see all your faces, because I would imagine many of you probably nodding or shaking your head, because for those of us who've worked on the ground with people, we know that that's a reality. From our elected officials, city staff, the other groups of people that we asked about food, similar things. We saw that partnerships were really effective. And then our second most popular response for what was working were the additional funding sources from the pandemic relief funds. Cities, organizations have done a great job figuring out how to leverage those dollars. But while this is in the what's working section, I just want us, to call it out in a sense that those are dollars that have a time cap on them. And we know that a lot of critical and vital community food programs have been put in place using these pandemic relief funds, which are, going to expire soon. And then we saw synchronicity here as well. So these folks talked about transportation. They said that, there just aren't food banks in all parts of my city. There is a lot of food banks in one region and not the other. People also spoke about seniors who couldn't get to the food banks, and then similar economic factors and lack of information. So in summary about food insecurity, our key gaps from this gap analysis that we discovered were really centered around accessibility, needing additional food banks that were more dispersed throughout communities and throughout the region, needing additional transportation to and from food banks, as well as evening and weekend hours to truly make them more accessible to people. And then we saw this desire and request and gap in healthy or fresh food, which could potentially be met by additional farmers markets or grocery stores, etc. And then when asked about how to increase access to food overall, these economic factors that we saw in the homelessness space came up as well. People just talking about cost of living increases and specifically not having enough food stamps to cover these cost of living increases. And similar to the homelessness data, we just, wanted to check ourselves and see, well, how does this align with what's going on across the country? And as you can see here, our findings were similar. Long lines at food banks given inflation rates, how public transportation is something which increases inequality in the United States, thinking beyond just what we label as a food desert, just because there is a food bank or a food pantry giving out food in a community, our data challenges us all to ask the question of, can people get to it? Can they get from it? And can they get there with a work schedule? And then this awareness or consciousness of what will happen when the pandemic relief dollars run out. And then we'll transition into substance use. And Nathan, anything major from the food data or any big questions?
Just that, I mean, one of the things that was mentioned by Eric was connecting food access, specifically around food storage and refrigeration, to the population of people experiencing homelessness. And so I was actually just going to say, so it'll save me the response, Eric, that I think that would be potentially another good follow-up study to drill in specifically into the issue of food storage and refrigeration relating to that population. A lot of our food questions were to the food insecure population, but I think for a follow-up study, even if it was a micro study, that would be an interesting topic. So
that's a great point. We just had so much data that it was tricky to figure out what made it to the presentation, but among people who were on the streets and food insecure, that single factor was the top issue that they brought up, was that they didn't have refrigeration or a way to carry their food. Like they just didn't even have a big enough bag to get food. So now we're going to transition into substance abuse and addiction. We have data on this from people who were experiencing homelessness, keeping in mind that over 60% of our homeless population self-reported a substance use. So we have some data from that group. And then we also have data from 68 people who were not experiencing homelessness. So people who were actively in a program, or we posted an online survey to a couple of Facebook pages for people in recovery. And that was how we recruited participants for this data. So this is of people who were experiencing homelessness and addiction. We asked them, what has been the most challenging part in receiving help for your substance abuse and addiction? And the number one thing that came up was pride and shame. People being ready to quit, not believing in themselves, comments about taking the first step. This number two theme of addiction itself, again, thinking of what I kept in mind about the integrity of qualitative data coding, a lot of folks just said addiction. They said things like staying clean, withdrawals. So a lot of folks, when they were speaking about their barriers, they were just really focused on their addiction. They were very caught in it. And then this lack of a support system, which again, if we keep in mind the homelessness data that came up, if you think of the food insecurity data and people not having transportation, this is where we also see this common thread of needing more of a support system or a network. Because we know that we have these gaps, right? And people here are talking about how challenging it is to be around people who use, how having strained family relationships. Similar, we see that services were inaccessible, but interestingly, when you compare homelessness and food insecurity, people experiencing the issue of addiction said that they were more accessible than other areas. So some access issues for sure, specifically transportation and finding the right program came up. As well as meeting basic needs. So these are folks who are on the streets and they said that I just need a shower or a place to sleep and then I will be clean. And I'm going to skip through some of the quote slides, y'all. Sorry, I just want to make sure we have enough time to get through all of the data and to answer some of the questions. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker through this next section. When we asked housed people, so again, people in programs who are not on the streets, their most challenging part in receiving help, they said pride and shame as well. And then here we saw, because these folks were people who were in treatment and had gone through the process, a lot of the access issues that they brought up included wait lists, not having one nearby where their family or friend could, support them, things like that. And then we also saw of this group, specifically people spoke about health issue. So people saying, I need to work on my mental health first, or I really need aftercare. And what was meant by that, we saw this population specifically reference the gap in not having anywhere to go after detox or after a program. So people are in detox for 72 hours, people shared this, and then where do they go? Or these folks were saying, I'm doing really great in this program and I'm really worried about what's going to happen because I have medical needs or I need further health care in terms of my addiction and not knowing where to get that. This was one thing that we really wanted to point out to y'all. It's a little tricky, so I'll just kind of talk you through it. But we often encounter this question of, well, what came first, homelessness or addiction? What we did here was we looked at everyone who answered the question of how long they were experiencing homelessness. And then of those people who were also experiencing addiction, how long were they experiencing their addiction? If you start at the top right corner, this 70 bubble here, what that tells us is there is a clear relationship between the amount of time that people have been homeless and the amount of time that they've been struggling with addiction. In a lot of cases, for these 70 individuals, the two were the same, which tells us that for those folks, addiction probably came first or right at the same time. There's an overlay between those two issues. As you look at this top row and you move towards the left, what's interesting is that you'll see that for some people, their time experiencing homelessness is either greater than their time experiencing addiction or less. And so really the takeaway here is just things that we all know, but things that this data helps us understand is that there isn't a generalization that could be made about, oh, well, all people who are on the streets had addiction first. This multivariable plot shows us that it's both, that for a lot of people, addiction did come first. And then for some people, addiction came after. So if you look at on the top row, specifically this number here, we see people who were homeless for 2 to 6 months with more than 5 years of substance use. So their substance use is longer than their homelessness. And then we see other points where that's not the case. And we really just wanted to share this with you all again to highlight that it's complicated. There's, I know often people want to know the exact, well, what is it? What came first? And our data, when we compared these two responses, show a variety of situations, people in different walks of life, people who, again, addiction came before or after. So in summary, when we think about addiction, the top reason whether people were on the streets or not experiencing homelessness, the reason that they weren't seeking help was because of pride of shame. And it was the top response in both groups. And then the real thing that we saw here was this lack of familial support as a key challenge. People saying, I don't have anyone, I don't have a support network, etc. And then we saw barriers to service as well because the services don't exist nearby or they can't get there. Other barriers that came up included health issues, costs for treatment, wait lists, etc. And this came up as well in the interviews with elected officials, first responders, and city staff. It was really interesting to see, specifically among firefighters, how articulate and how much they spoke to these barriers. The firefighters that we spoke to seemed to have the most comments about barriers to substance abuse services, second to people who were, again, experiencing themselves. And so across all of this data, people, want to know, what's the regional trend? What's the takeaway? We so wish that we had data that said, in this city, this is the bigger issue, and this is the pathway to addressing all of these challenges. If I could have figured that out, That would be awesome, but I haven't quite got there yet. Maybe version 2 of this gap analysis will get there. But the one thing to just point out was that there was a lot of movement. So we had a goal of surveying X number of people in every city. And we had people in every city who we surveyed in Mesa, for example, who listed that they were sleeping in Scottsdale or in Tempe. And so really just pointing that out because we saw a lot of comments about the role of partnerships. And another key thing that we learned from the study, because of this movement of people between cities, because of the number of people who we surveyed in one city, but listed another city as their home, there's a need for us all to really come together as a region, and those conversations are happening. People are, starting that work or continuing that work, but this study really just highlights the need for it even more. I'm gonna skip that for now. And so really just to wrap this up and to leave some time for discussion, for questions, I want to thank Phoenix Rescue Mission for their investment in this community issue, in these issues. They invested in over 850 hours of my consulting services for the design, research, data collection, analysis, everything. They purchased 760 $10 gift cards for people who were experiencing homelessness. And there really are infinite possibilities for ways for us to use this data. This is a starting point. I'm really excited. I hope that this for all of you can be an entry point to thinking about ways to better understand these issues, address the gaps, etc. We really, really, really want to thank the people who were directly impacted, who contributed to this study. People at food banks who were in line waiting for food, people in recovery, people on the streets. Yeah, they received a $10 gift card, but these surveys were long. They asked about so many personal things, and so just nothing but appreciation, love, gratitude, and respect for the people who are affected by these things, who wanted to provide their feedback. We had great municipal and regional partners. We had a lot of emails with folks at MAG, and I bugged people a lot there about the data that was available, folks at 211 and the Housing Coalition for hosting this event with us, for co-hosting it, for being so excited to share this with you all. The title of the session was Data for Decision Making, and I've presented on this in a couple of contexts. This to me is the meat of this, and what I know personally, I don't want to speak for Nathan, but what I want us to all really think about, and I'll chime in and then Nathan, you can go next, but from the ground up as an organization, this data is an opportunity for future contracts to understand the need for further education and awareness. How do we educate people about what's available to them, and then the community at large? How do we facilitate change of hearts so that we can build more housing and shelter and do the things that we need to do in a thoughtful way that is good for communities? Faith partners were so eager to do more. All of them were like, Ash, please follow up. Like, once you get this, like, let's get funding and let's do this, let's do that. Like, we have a huge opportunity with our faith partners. And Nathan, do you want to speak for the mission, how this data has been meaningful to y'all and how you've used it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ash. Again, the purpose of this is for us to make decisions and from there to drive action. One of the things as a service provider, I know so many of you share this experience, is that there seems like a frustration with the endless amount of data that's available that just feels like data overload, and then you don't know what to do with it. And it sometimes can feel like actions and decisions are not coming from that. Now, there are absolutely exceptions to that. And I would love for this to be one. So as an example, I can talk about what the Phoenix Rescue Mission is doing with this. So we took information from this. Again, it also had, we asked questions in other phases of the survey regarding issues specific to our campuses as well as to the region. And from there formed a planning committee that is figuring out what does this mean for Phoenix Rescue Mission short-term and long-term future. And we're doing a bunch of strategic vision casting, as you see there. I also think I can apply this not just from my own organization, but many of us sit in different seats throughout the region. So for instance, I sit as the co-chair of the COC committee through MAG. And there's a place in my conversation going back and forth around McKinney-Vento homelessness that you may have seen in the chat. We know that there are gaps in our system related to McKinney-Vento homelessness and the broader homelessness system. And that committee has a work group focused specifically on plugging gaps between systems of care called the Connecting to Other Systems of Care work group. So then not only do I have a way to apply the data at the mission and figure out what it means for us long-term, but I'm thinking beyond just my own organization about the region at large and saying, hey, in the places and the spaces where I'm working, how can we use this to drive whether further research or more importantly, further action? So my encouragement to everyone is to not let this drop and to do the same kind of thing. What does this mean for your agency? What does it mean for the region at large from your perspective? And to form groups, to do whatever it takes, but to drive action most importantly.
Great, thank you. So these were just some ideas of discussion questions. So feel free to look through these and put any of them in the chat. Nathan and Linda are my eyes and ears. But before we do that, maybe were there other questions? I know, Nathan, you had put some stuff aside for the end. So really just want to answer any questions or have any discussion.
There's just some follow-up things. Like one of the simple one was how many people responded yes to the veterans question. And so instead of like digging that out right now, I figured we can maybe follow up with that one later.
Okay, perfect.
But yeah, no, otherwise, any questions that anyone has, we can take them now.
Cool, yeah. So
there was one other one, and this one might be for later too. Rita asked, who wrote the article, 3 years in a shelter, 10 months to find a home. It didn't have an author's name on the slide.
Okay.
So we can follow up with that one as well.
Yeah, and the link to that is on the slide in the box at the bottom. You couldn't see it, but when you get the slides, like where you put your notes and comments, all of the links are in there. So you'll have that too. Any other questions or thoughts or things that we could speak to, perhaps, while we still have some time together? And if not, there's one really interesting slide that I skipped. I'm happy to go back to that with our Likert scale data.
Yeah, Ash, so we have so far responded to everything. Nothing new has come up.
Cool.
I'll keep monitoring, but yeah, go back to the other slide.
Okay, cool. Before I do that, to just, all right, yeah, then we'll talk about next steps, but I'm gonna go back. So as we mentioned, there was a quantitative component of this. I skipped this initially because it takes a bit of explaining, but for all of the groups that we surveyed, people experiencing it in the focus groups and the interviews, we had Likert scale questions. And the question was, how much do you agree with the following statements, where 1 was strongly disagree and 5 was strongly agree? And we did this because we wanted, again, some sort of quantitative way to look and see what would the numbers tell us. Would they align with the qualitative data? As a mixed methods researcher, that's constantly the work, right? Do they agree? Is there contradictions, etc.? So we asked generally, or we provided statements that said, there are resources for homelessness in my city, etc. And people responded to those. The next category of statements were specifically about access and adequacy. So example of a statement given was, the services for people struggling with food insecurity are adequate and accessible. Depending on who we interviewed, we may have just like tweaked the wording to have it make sense. So if you were someone who was experiencing food insecurity at a food bank, the statement would say, the food services I receive are adequate and accessible, but that was the nature of it. And that's just an example. What the numbers told us here were that of the 3 categories, so access and adequacy of 1, general availability, and then this awareness piece, the lowest section pertained to access and adequacy. So when you looked at the means, the mean for this was at 2.84. So for every person who answered these questions about how adequate and accessible resources were, the mean was at 2.84, and it was lower than statements that said people know where they can go for help or there are resources available. The statement that received the lowest score of every statement that we put was the statement, there are accessible and adequate homeless shelters in my city. The mean of that was at 2.24. Again, keeping in mind that a 1 would be, I strongly disagree with that, and 5 is I strongly agree with it. And then for people who were experiencing food insecurity, the biggest gap was not receiving enough food to last until their next visit. So we had a statement for those folks that said, the food I get at food banks is enough to last until the next time I go. And that was the lowest scoring in this access category. We then asked about awareness. We wanted to know, okay, well, in the spirit of a true gap analysis, you constantly ask yourself, are there resources? Are they adequate or accessible? And do people know about them? So this category were our awareness statements. Example being, members of the community are informed about the resources and programs available to people experiencing homelessness. If you were experiencing homelessness, the statement was, I know where I can go for help if I'm homeless. For people needing food, it was, I know where I can go if I can't afford my own food. We just kind of, again, tweaked it so it was appropriate to who we were asking. But across all of the groups, the least amount of awareness of our three issues was related to homelessness, followed by substance use. So the mean for the homeless services stuff was 2.85, and then it was at 2.88 for awareness about substance abuse services. The other key things that we learned from looking at all of our Likert scale data and comparing these numbers, when we look at every Likert scale question, every group that answered, the lowest scoring by a decent amount was this statement about adequate and accessible shelter. And for people experiencing homelessness specifically, of the 754 total people and of the people who answered that, the mean was a 1.68, and that was our lowest mean of any question. So just really want us to sit with us and ground that, you know, that was why we really wanted to center the people impacted, because to us, it meant a lot that the lowest score, or the people who see the biggest gaps in shelter, are people needing it, which is definitely worth paying attention to. And then when we look at each population, so faith partners, case managers, city council members, et cetera, when we look at all of those, on average, the lowest scores came from people who were experiencing homelessness. So again, to reiterate my point, a lot of the people navigating the resources had the strongest level of disagreement about their availability, adequacy, and their knowledge of them. I know this is a bit confusing, but we tried to simplify it as much as possible. And before, you know, just again, thinking of what the qualitative data told us, it adds up, it checks out, right? We saw a lot of comments about there being services, but people not being able to utilize them or access them. And then second, people not knowing about them or knowing where to go. Nathan, anything else on this? Because I know there's a lot here.
No, not necessarily on this slide. There's a lot here, I think, that I could go on and on and on about, and I won't right now, because there were some other questions that did come in that I think were worth bringing up. So first of all, let me just throw a couple of things out. I've kind of mentioned this in the chat in a couple of ways, but to say it out loud, obviously, this was a big scope for a project of this kind, for us anyway. And we know that there's so many other things that we didn't ask. I've learned ways that we could have asked things a different way. For instance, the veteran versus the more nuanced military question. So there's just some good things. I think what we're doing is we'll eventually put out a report, and that report will have some recommendations for future things that could happen, whether actions or research. And so I've taken note of some of those because I think there have been some really good ideas. Also to shout out potential future collaborations. You know, I saw some people in the chat talking about, you know, I think maybe Lynn and Samantha talking about a project that they have together that some of this data may be useful for. I think that's really awesome. So shout out to stuff like that. Also, I can't wait to talk more about McKinney-Vento homelessness. And so again, just encourage that we do more and more of those kinds of conversations around future collaborations. I think that we can do some work, that there we have a recommendation for more research in rural areas around regarding homelessness in Maricopa County and in the state of Arizona. Both of those things came in. So just an acknowledgement that even if I can't get to all of those things, I am taking note of them and that we do have a place for that. Also, and then so there was a couple of questions. I'll take some easy ones, and Ash, I'll give you the hard ones. But there was a question, I think there was a question about sharing the information. Rita, you said this is incredibly insightful. As homeless practitioners, we're well aware of these issues and feedback. Curious how this information will be shared out and who else will have the opportunity to attend a presentation. So we're making it known that if people want to have a presentation of this information, we're more than welcome. We're more than happy to do that with them. And so if you know people who you think would be good for us to present to, please reach out and let us know. Also, we're going to do a press release with this information. Eventually, we haven't really planned that out yet, but that is going to happen pretty soon. And with that, some kind of potential get together, I imagine, will come out of that so that we can make sure that we're touching not just the people who are from our own industry who are quite aware of this information. Eric, you asked, based on what you learned in this study, is there anything you would suggest to Access as they continue to develop their approach to the H2O initiative? Man, there's so much here. I think the thing is to use this and to go deeper into answering that question. I can give you a knee jerk from my perspective. First of all, what I'll say is it's important to connect this data to all of the other data sets that are available, to the pit count data, to the system performance trends data that's available if you're in Maricopa County through MAG and through Solari, and to go and connect this to those other data sets and to answer some of those questions. One of the things that I know those other data sets talk about is that there is a lack of supportive services that could be potentially behind some of the reason why there are high rates of return from homelessness from rapid rehousing projects specifically. So there is one thing that I know is a problem from another data set that is potentially tied to a lack of supportive services that are helping people sustain themselves in permanent housing solutions. And this data also says that there is a combination of a lack of healthcare services for people who are experiencing homelessness. So one of the things I would say is make sure that supportive services are being emphasized as you're thinking about the H2O initiative and what to do with that. Micah, you asked the question, I hear that y'all didn't see many seniors in your sample. For those of us doing elder/aging adult work in communities, do you have suggestions on how we might go about trying to conduct that kind of survey based on your experience? Ash?
The real thing that I would suggest, Micah, is like the being with organizations directly. I mean, that to me was the key to getting all of this data, was just, being someone with a direct service experience who could easily text someone and say, hey, I need to do a ride along with you, or things like that. So I think the methodology is incredibly transferable, and it's just a matter of going where there are more seniors and then maybe, making some of the questions a little more friendly. That was a learning curve of needing to simplify some of the language because it got confusing for people. So that would be my only other tip. And before you go to the next question, Nathan, something we didn't say, but that I forgot to mention, for all of the cities, we really, really tried to be in all areas of the city, right? So for Phoenix, we were in the zone, but we were in way North Phoenix, like West Phoenix, every area. In Surprise, I was like with Phoenix Rescue Mission in a truck going down the washes, like to the river bottom. So we definitely tried as hard as we could to include diverse perspectives, right? We didn't want to just have one part of Mesa, one part of Phoenix. Like we didn't, we tried to keep that diverse as well.
Does anyone know the status of the Governor's Interagency Council on Homelessness? Is anyone on this call participating? Rita asked that. If you know whether that's the case or not, you can add that to the chat. And then finally, this info may be helpful for the City of Phoenix Homeless Solutions Office as they are tasked with cleaning up the zone and working on their planning to do so. City of Phoenix was one of our partners. One of the things I didn't mention is we're going to be rolling city-specific information out to each partner. They also have been invited to this and the follow-up presentation next week. And I'm a partner with the City of Phoenix. We're contracted with them to provide outreach services for the next 3 years. So they will for sure be getting their hands on this data and already have.
Yeah, that's for all of our city partners on the call. It's about a week and a half, 2 weeks tops. You'll have pretty just like fancy one pager that's formatted nicely that you could use however you want. And then you'll have a detailed Word document with all of your city specific data. And that's just our thank you for your participation and for your support. I bugged a lot of you so many times via email, so I cannot say thank you enough. And we really appreciate it. Next steps, Nathan,
yeah,
right? We have,
yeah, no, go
um,
ahead.
we have I'll let Linda speak to some of the next steps from the coalition, but on next Tuesday from 9:30 to 11, we're doing another meeting for people who couldn't make this one. Again, this will be recorded, but if you have someone else on your team that you want to attend, please just email us. I think you should have my email, but I'll put it in the chat so that you all have it. We'll send out this document. We're still working on the full report again because there's just so much data, but this will go out to you. You can send it, share it, and just cannot reiterate enough our appreciation and also how important it is that this data gets out. We want everyone to have this, to hear this presentation, to do whatever they need with it in a way that's helpful. So I'll turn it over to Nathan maybe for any last things, and then if Linda has something. But from my end, thank you all for being here. It was a privilege doing this work. It was probably the greatest privilege I've had was to work on this and to understand these issues in this depth and to work with you all. So thank you.
And I don't have anything to add other than thank you all for your participation, just echoing that. And thanks in advance for the work that you'll do with this and the other data that's available in our community.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Nathan. This was a really good presentation, and thank you for your work, not only on this, but day to day, because I know that each of you has a deep, deep commitment to this work. We have a couple of folks who I think are able to ask their questions verbally. We've got Maria and Megan that may, if they're still around, they may want to ask their questions. So I welcome them to do so. Maria, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Linda. Thank you to Ash and Nathan. This is Maria Chaveste. It was really that last item you pointed out about the key findings. I was curious, and you kind of called it out about, how are we addressing homelessness from the perception of those currently experiencing it compared to those that are trying to find solutions, the service providers, whether they're nonprofit, government, et cetera. So I thank you for pointing that out and just trying to see if you think there's a trend that we can get that gap closer together. And again, thank you for bringing the voice of those that don't have it to this study. But I think it's a good, we're on the right track. But yeah, I think that's the gap is that's the issue is how do we close that gap?
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, I agree, Maria. And in an ideal world, there would be a much easier platform where you wouldn't need a consultant because people living this would have a lot of power and access to share their perspectives themselves. But that's a lifelong journey for us all to figure out as a region.
Yeah, and then just a question at the beginning, you pointed out, and apologize, I did put this in chat because I don't have access to chat, but you pointed out on the demographics, and there seemed to be a higher percentage of Hispanic Latino population in this study compared to what we see in Point in Time or others. I was just curious if any of you guys thought of or wondering why that is the difference.
Yeah, so yeah, I wish I would have spent more time, but as people know who are representative of that identity, all of our demographics we matched with census things so that we could compare them apples to apples. And as some of you know, like people who are Hispanic or Latino in terms of race are supposed to or encouraged to put white because according to the classification of this system that the census is, that's where you fall. So what we did was we had a lot of people who put other or who specifically wrote out Hispanic Latinx. And so that is why ours is probably higher, because what I anticipate is like when it's not coded or gone through, or like people don't specifically write in or aren't given an option to put in their own identity, then you would probably see less people who don't put that and just put white, because that's what people are used to. So we were that took a long time to do, but it felt really important. If someone went through the trouble of writing their identity or the pride of their identity, we wanted to include it.
And it looks like Megan had to leave. So those were the only questions that we had verbally.
Oh, I saw one comment in the chat, one more about data on incarceration and homelessness. We asked people in the last month how many times they had been incarcerated, And I want to say off the top of my head, the average was like less than 1. But that was a tricky one because we had a huge range. We had people who put that in the last month, they had been incarcerated like 6 to 10 times. I think the highest person said, oh, I think I've been arrested like 10 times or 12 times in the last month. But we don't have data on if people were incarcerated previously. That's just how we ask that. So that's another further direction or deeper path to go. And it didn't come up as a primary reason for homelessness either. Thank you all.
So thanks, folks. For those who are still hanging in there with us, know that you will get a follow-up email probably tomorrow with all of the information that we've promised you. And big kudos to our research team. And I hope that we hear more from them because this work is so important. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.